My name is Dr.G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Welcome to another exciting episode of That's Unusual. I'm just amazed of all of the positive reviews and the thousands of downloads we've been receiving each week for this podcast. If you haven't already, I'd love for you to join us as well by subscribing on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Just search for That's Unusual and voila, you will get the episodes directly into your player. Today, I go deep to uncover some fascinating stories from my good friend and colleague, Leerom Segal. He's the co-founder and CEO of Klick, as well as the author of the best-selling book, The Decoded Company. His story is anything but usual. Against all odds, he built Klick over 20 years from a scrappy technology company to now one of the world's largest and most sought-after independent creative health agencies. But calling it an agency doesn't do it justice. They're out to change the world through the relentless pursuit of awesome. In this episode, we discuss his unlikely rise through grit, persistence, and continuous hustle to build one of the most envious companies, his determination to succeed by outworking and outsmarting his competition, his unusual practices to attract the best and brightest talent, and why most organizations today are struggling to adapt because of outdated leadership models and policies. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open the doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. With me today is my good friend, Leerom Segal. Welcome to the show, Lee.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. G.
Yeah, it's so nice having you on and getting to know you from a different angle. Now, you've got such an inspiring story of both grit and hustle, and you tend to do things that are largely unconventional, that bucks the norm. Of course, people see you now in today's world as a successful entrepreneur and a businessman, with probably more awards to your name than someone can count. From what I know, life didn't really start out that way for you, and so you really beat the odds and created success and carved your own path along the way. Can you take us back to sort of little Lee and tell us about your beginnings and what that was like and how you got to where you are?
Sure. So how early do you want me to go?
Well, go back to when you think you sort of saw some transformational moments or
sure.
Figured out in life, what were the key influences?
It sounds great. So really start the journey in an interesting transition in life for me. And that was when we moved to Canada from Israel. My family came from fairly humble beginnings, and the entrepreneurial journey really started at that age. We were doing lawn mowing and shoveling and taking a lot of different swing and misses at businesses. Probably the most unique thing about that time was that I realized that I enjoyed much more organizing my friends than actually doing the lawn mowing and the shoveling. And and ultimately, we figured out that little kids could get a little bit of respect when it came to technology. And so we got very fortunate with that insight and got very fortunate with my upbringing. From a very young age, my father instilled a lot of confidence in us, but also taught us a lot of really important life lessons. I'll share one with you because it sort of speaks to one of the two things that keeps me up at night, and that's with respect to debt. So from about age 8, almost everything with my father was done in a contract. He just wanted to get me used to that, and then he really taught me the cost and expense of interest by essentially taking my allowance and having compounded interest do mean things with it. And at about age 9.5, right before my 10th birthday, I remember having to take all these things that I loved, the Sega Saturns, my favorite toys, and had to give it all away and declare bankruptcy. And that really created and instilled an incredible sense of fear about any form of mortgaging the future, that debt. And I think that's really shaped a lot of how we've thought about business and how we've grown our organization over the years. But really the key inflection point from that period came a few years later when, crawling through a family friend's ceiling, installing a high-end audiovisual system. And back then you needed Ethernet cables for that. We overheard an investor in what later would become my business partner's company, Peter Cordy, talking about how they had sold this project and it was an impossible project. And this was a Thursday night, and this arrogant little 12-year-old crawls back down through the ceilings and say, hey, you know what? That project doesn't sound that complicated. And just to give you context, the project was taking the 1050 chum charts and digitizing them and creating an index that was searchable online. A little bit harder to do than it is today, but essentially it's the same as the billboards in the US. And on a Friday morning, after biking to Peter's office and showing up a little bit early, I was summoned into his boardroom, which felt like the longest boardroom in the world at the time. And there was this really big man. To this day, I call him Shrek. And when he finished howling, because he was just laughing, this kid's going to solve our problems. And we managed to convince him over the course of an hour that he had nothing to lose by just giving us the source code and the weekend to think about how we would approach this problem. And our promise was that he wouldn't have to give us anything down. And if we figured it out, then this would be an insurance policy on his team. And if we didn't, he could still have his team continue working on it. And from there, after he gave us that first bit of trust and gave us the sources, we biked down to the world's biggest bookstore because you didn't have the web back then. You had the internet, but you didn't have the web, and started just consuming the books that we needed. We ultimately end up staying up for 72 hours. And at this point, I have to highlight my business partner, Aaron Goldstein, was actually the better coder. So the two of us coded like maniacs. But Monday morning, sure enough, instead of going to school, biked over to Peter's office and said, hey, it's done. Pay us what you think is fair. And that began a journey that's really shaped so much of our life because from that day forward, we worked together with Peter. And eventually we would become business partners with Peter. There was a lot of key inflection points along the way, including convincing both my parents, but also the school that I should be permitted to do a double co-op. And ultimately, Peter sold his business, and his business in turn got sold to a company called HealthLink, which got bought by a company called Greenlight, which got bought by a company called MotionWorks. But here we were at age 16, and at that point, having followed Peter through this journey for a couple of years, we ended up as the chief technology officer of MotionWorks Group. And that should sound like an amazing experience, having a team in Tokyo and Vancouver and New York and Toronto and Montreal and all of these responsibilities. But actually at 16, we were pretty depressed. And it was because the organization that we were a part of was really being managed to the next press release. It was being managed out of spreadsheets. And as you can probably appreciate, creative and strategic talent doesn't always appreciate being managed in that way. And we started to lose our best people, which were really the thing that energized us. And so 2 years into this 4-year earnout that was negotiated, we had a really clear fork in the road. We were going to leave with money or we were going to leave with sanity, but it was clear that we were not going to have both. That brings us all the way to April of 1997 when we finally decided that the stuff that we were doing for Segasoft and Fox Interactive, it was sexy stuff, but it was not what we wanted to do, and it was not whom we wanted to do it with. And we started the quest that is still a core part of our mission today at Klick, and that is in really trying to figure out how do you build a center of gravity for really brilliant and inspiring individuals. And our belief back then was, maybe it was Pollyanna, but it was that, if we just got the culture right, we wouldn't just attract the right individuals, but those people would thrive. And if those people were happy, they'd make our clients happy. And if our clients were happy, they'd reward us with loyalty and growth. And that's a very virtuous cycle. And that's the belief system that still shapes who we are as an organization. Obviously, operationalizing that and scaling that has turned out to be a little bit harder done than said. And we've collected a lot of learnings along the way, but that still is a core part of what energizes us.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of that secret sauce that you have around the culture with Klick. But before we get into that, I mean, what was the genesis of Klick Health itself. I mean, here you were, as a technologist, as a coder. Klick today is best known as sort of an independent digital marketing company, highly creative, servicing mostly the healthcare industry, but also beyond that. But it had its early days as a technology company. Tell us about how you got that started and how you ultimately landed to being sort of a creative digital marketing company that you are today.
So there were really a bunch of variables at play, but one of the frustrating conversation that almost felt like it was on a repeat loop with the leadership of MotionWorks was that we saw a tremendous amount of opportunity in the healthcare space, but they were really positioned as an entertainment company. And we went a few times and tried to convey this, and we said, hey, look, this work that we're doing for nonprofits, the team is really appreciating it. They're really enjoying it. They're really energized by it. And it also happens to be profitable. And we were told a few times, healthcare is a cash cow. We're an entertainment company. And, you're kind of like 16 and you're looking around and you're saying, well, I thought profit was how we kept score. And one of the other things that we saw the entertainment business creating is this constant wave of major surges in work and major lulls. And these peaks and valleys manifested themselves in a lot of pain for the team because with every one of those surges, a lot of people would be hired and then a lot of people would be let go when the work dried up. And what we wanted was predictability and consistency. And what we also knew was that our core strengths at the time was really our technology heritage. And so we did a lot of analysis on the market. And I think that this is something that anybody starting a business should really be doing because it's a lot easier to build a business when you've got great tailwinds.
And this is back when? What year?
So this is back in 1997.
97, so right during that internet heyday.
It's the internet heyday. A lot of people are pursuing business models that maybe aren't fully baked. We were thinking about what's going to happen with healthcare more broadly. And certainly we couldn't have known some of the things that have happened since, including, Obamacare and 40 million uninsured. But what we did know is that the demographics suggested that healthcare was going to be a growing market. The lifestyle of the average person we knew, whether in Canada or the US, was that they were sleeping too little, moving too little, eating too much, stressing too much. And when you actually looked at historicals and saw what happens in these markets when the economy goes down, what you'd actually see is that these diseases like diabetes, diseases that are stress-related and cardiovascular diseases, these would all be on the rise, actually. So we kind of felt that if it wasn't anti-cyclical, it was at least somewhat more predictable and consistent than your typical industry. And that's what gave us the confidence to focus on the healthcare space. Now, over time, we'd also learned that these patents that our clients have, they're much more than just patent life. They're also patient life. And we built a real appreciation for the human impact of our work. But we didn't really know that back then. What we then had to figure out is how do we get into the space? And we were incredibly blessed that a few of these nonprofits that we had worked with had reached out and they wanted some help with IT services, essentially. And ultimately, what ended up happening is that by 1998, many of the pharmaceutical websites had been hacked and phallic symbols put on the homepage with the rise of ED drugs and things like that. And that created a window for us to come in and offer a pretty unique suite of services that essentially allowed us to do all the web implementation for these clients. And these were major manufacturers. And at the time, it was the Canadian affiliates of major manufacturers. But for all of these major players, what we would do is essentially act as the single group that would take whatever their marketing teams or other groups were producing. And we wouldn't touch necessarily the creative or the content, but we would implement it. And we'd implement it in such a way that the technology stack provided better measurement and better accountability. And, media and ad tech technology wasn't what it is today. So we were able to systematically get smarter about what it was that we were talking to our clients about. We'd layer on consulting services on the front end and on the tail end of the process. So we'd say, hey, we've been thinking about the user experience. Here's a test that we've done. And, when you have the data to support your convictions, it makes it a lot easier to drive change. So that allowed us to really start layering on some of the user experience and digital strategy and creative services at the front end, as well as some of the optimization on the media side on the tail end. And before you knew it, we were acting as what I would sort of label today as a digital AOR for most of the brands that we served.
Mm-hmm.
But we also were helping them a lot with their internal systems, so building their intranets and helping them communicate more effectively internally. And over time, we turned our focus to the U.S. market as well, and started to replicate some of the things that we were doing in Canada. And today, we still have most of those Canadian relationships that I just spoke about, but they represent a very small percentage of our revenues. And well over 90% of our revenues is now really helping these US-based pharmaceutical and biotech clients to commercialize.
I find it so interesting that you talk about healthcare back in the day of, being this predictable and consistent marketplace with, significant profit potential. It's funny because I feel like there's almost this element of naivety, which played to your advantage back in the day, because anybody who looks at trying to carve their path into healthcare today without any experience or background in the space would oftentimes be met with a lot of resistance. And I feel like it's almost that, that sort of wide-eyed naivety sense in terms of what healthcare could offer you that allowed you to essentially carve out some opportunities down that path. And in a sense, Klick now, what is 18, 19 years running, you have had to adapt and evolve, not just as an organization as you grow, but also as a healthcare industry has shifted and changed over the past, decade plus. What would you say? I mean, you tend to run a lot of experiments with your organization. What would you say are some of the unconventional things that you've tried over the years that have now turned into a little bit of your secret sauce that has made you guys so successful?
Sure. Well, I think more than anything, it's the mindset with which we approach everything. We talk a lot internally about the relentless pursuit of awesome. And that may sound trite, but really it's how do you inoculate yourself against the status quo, and how do you build a culture where people understand that whatever greatness you achieved yesterday, it's no longer good enough, and that we're constantly trying to behave as though we're in beta. And one of the benefits that we had is that as partners, we didn't really have professional management experience. And so to your point about sort of entering spaces that are more difficult, sometimes a huge part of that is relentlessness and grit and curiosity and optimism in the face of inevitable obstacles. But, when there's the front door and the back door are closed, there's always a third door or a window that you can sort of use to find your way. And for us, initially, it was really around how we executed the work. One of the things that we really built for ourselves, and it's probably one of the places where we're really differentiated, is systems to help us organize and orchestrate the work more creatively. And if you sort of accept that having a more talent-centric workplace can help you execute and evolve faster, and we believe that, then one of the questions that becomes sort of obvious is, why are all the apps that we have on our phone, why is it that we love those apps? And why is it that most people are kind of put off by the enterprise technology that's available to them? And we believe that a huge part of it is that the apps that we choose to download for our personal lives, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, and the Spotifys, the Netflix, these are all apps that take the time to understand us and personalize our news, shopping, entertainment, travel, and other needs. And yet we go into the workplace and suddenly we're beholden to these one-size-fits-all solutions, solutions that increase bureaucracy and limit autonomy and speed and are disempowering to teams. And so we started to reject some of the very basic tools that most businesses operate on. Probably most famously, we rejected email. We believe that email is a great way to let others reprioritize your day for you. And that by drastically reducing email, because we can't eliminate it because our clients still use it, but by drastically reducing it internally, what we're able to do is give people more time in flow state. And this was fairly obvious to Aaron, who first had this insight, because he was thinking, it wasn't that long ago that people used to organize events via email, send photo albums, but Facebook sort of solved this problems. And why aren't tools in the workplace doing similar things? And before we knew it, it wasn't just how we communicated. It was also how we organized meetings and how we budgeted projects and how we orchestrated the workflow around those projects. And whether it was project controls, financial controls, how we organized meetings, how we provided our people with situational awareness and tried to use data to inform people's intuition, watch their blind spots, spots and really create much better situational awareness across our team. Each one of these capabilities was really born out of a battle scar or something that we saw as getting in the way or interfering with our culture. And our goal was to give our people an intelligence advantage so that they could use data as more of a sixth sense, to give them an environment that allowed them to spend more time in flow, because we knew that that would make for happier and more engaged people. And to whatever degree possible, we wanted our organization to operate more like an ecosystem as opposed to a hierarchy. And so these are all things that ended up manifesting themselves in our people practices, in the technology that enables those people practices, and in how we really thought about our ecosystem.
And you couldn't go, I mean, rather than going out and trying to find these sort of piecemeal solutions that weren't really fitting your needs, I mean, you guys went ahead and just built your own operating system called Genome, correct?
Yeah, and I wish I could tell you that it was a grandmaster plan and that we had this vision at the beginning, but we really didn't. We had a mindset. We believed that technology can be a coach, and that in most workplaces, technology was acting like an angry referee because it was business rules driven. Something had happened, and an email went out, and it was all read, and so our inspiration was, what if we can get people to love their tools as much as they love the apps on their phone? What if we could rethink process from being this static thing that is built for the lowest common denominator into something that is more dynamic and understands if it's the first time or the 100th time that you're doing something? What if that technology wasn't just training based on process, but what if it was also providing you with interventions at a teachable moment? And an intervention could be, hey, talk to this person because they've just done this 40 times. What if our team could make more evidence-based decisions because of the information we put in front of them? And we trusted our people, I think, a lot, and we're a lot more open with information because we remembered how much we disliked the information asymmetry that existed in our MotionWorks days. And so all of this really came into play as we engineered our ecosystem. But ultimately, what I would say is more impressive about Genome is not what's in it. It's actually what we've removed. Because over the years, Aaron has really used this mindset of digital Darwinism, if you will. Mm-hmm. And what he's been really adamant about teaching the team is that if something isn't being used, it's probably because it's not saving people time. And instead of trying to enforce it, what we needed to do is creatively apply technology in a different way. And the result of taking that approach is that we ended up with all of these discrete tools that once we connected the dots on them, the insights that could be derived from the patterns of behaviors could really help our employees by watching their blind spots, by giving them the confidence to make decisions that would be less obvious in other environments. And when you get that right, what ends up happening is you create more opportunities for change and challenge and learning and all the things that people actually appreciate about their day-to-day experience. And today, Genome is really a manifestation of how we think. It represents itself in our hiring practices, in how we would onboard, how we think about feedback, how we do promotions. And you'll notice a lot of these things are sort of the softer things that would typically be handled by HR systems. But the problem that we saw invariably with almost every system that we looked at that was external was that in many ways, what people took inspiration from in the consumer web was the user experience. But what wasn't being critically thought about and what wasn't being taken apart and reduced back to first principles was actually the thought process around the actual process. So yes, Workday can take something like your annual performance review and make it look beautiful, but you're just putting lipstick on a pig because you're taking this relic from our agrarian roots called an annual performance review, and you're rendering it differently. You're not rethinking the problem. And that was where we saw the biggest opportunities. The biggest opportunities was taking a step back, really critically thinking about what it is that we're trying to achieve, and then asking ourselves questions like, what's possible today that wasn't possible 2 years ago or 5 years ago? And if that's something that we think would actually give us a strategic advantage, then we would want to invest in unleashing that advantage. And there's many things, just so you know, behind the scenes, like NetSuite and accounting, places where we don't want to be creative, where we have relied on external systems. But in terms of an experience for our people, there's one interface that they go to, and that really makes it a lot easier for us to adapt in a way that's more rapid, because once we make a change in Genome, which is really our everything system, it immediately manifests itself across the entire organization.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I certainly see the staff as being both more happy as well as more productive, which is just an amazing combination. A lot of this thinking that you're talking about here, as if you didn't have enough on your plate running a business with several hundred folks, you culminated a lot of this thinking into a book that you co-authored with some of your colleagues called The Decoded Company, Know Your People Better Than You Know Your Customers, which I'd imagine you want to sort of codify and put it into practice and share with the world. You touched upon a couple of the key principles without going into too much depth here. I know you talked a little bit about tech as a coach and data as a sixth sense. Can you talk about the three main principles that you share in that book that our listeners can take away with?
Sure. So the first one is really this notion of technology acting like a coach. If you think about the technology that you know and love on your phone, it takes the time to understand you and then personalize your experience. And we think that opportunity has been missed in most enterprise technology. The second is really this notion of instrumenting your organization in a way that allows data to act as a sixth sense. And what we mean by that is that most organizations operate on lag metrics. So it's things like financials, and those things inform you after the fact. And we believe that what you need to do is put lead indicators in front of your people so that to whatever degree possible, you can help them at the time of decision. And then the third is really this idea that ecosystems, in our opinion, will prevail over hierarchies. And if you sort of think about how the web is organized and how influence is gained on the web, there's really a lot of disregard for the hierarchy. And we think that that's a good thing. We think that that's an opportunity. And in everything within our organization, how feedback is provided, how recognition is provided, how people thank each other through our kudos system, what we've tried to do is really design our organization as an ecosystem so that decisions don't have to move up and down the hierarchy. And in fact, even things like promotions, to whatever degree possible, we're aiming to democratize them. And by that, what I really mean is give the team more control over the people that they're going to be working with. And that requires a lot of critical thinking about, what are those key inflection points in somebody's career as they're moving from being an individual contributor to leading a team, from leading a team to leading teams of teams, or what's the difference between craft leadership and account leadership and people leadership. Each one of them requires different strengths, and people's character in essence is really going to shape what they're going to be best suited for. So our belief, I guess, is that well, you can't have a perfectly balanced individual, or maybe we're wrong, but we don't believe that you can have perfectly balanced people. We do believe you can have fairly well-balanced teams, but you need to spend a lot more time thinking about that design.
I mean, incredible advice. I love the book. I love the principles, and that's just not me saying it. I mean, it is a bestseller book, and certainly a book that everyone should get their hands on. If you haven't already read it, certainly recommend it. It really challenges some of the everyday assumptions that we take for granted in the workplace, and I think it really brings to light in terms of not just how do we think differently about it, but how do we solve for it. And it's a wonderful book. So Lee, I want to shift gears here for a second and get a little philosophical with you. Klick tends to get bucketed in just because of the way the marketplace functions. It tends to get bucketed as an agency. But you and I know that it's much more than an agency. I mean, what do you see is changing in the world of advertising, marketing agencies? Where is the future headed, and how are you essentially positioning yourself to meet whatever that future may hold for you?
Sure. Well, I think that there's a lot of different ways to sort of take that apart. And for us as an organization, our mission is really to help our clients to commercialize. And in life sciences, as you know, that's a very unique journey. And it requires a lot more than just marketing services or marketing services paired with technology services. We believe that there's just a better way to orchestrate all the building blocks of these increasingly more complex programs and integrate with an increasingly more complex ecosystem to some of your points. At the core of the things that we think are wrong with the agency model today. One component part is that the leadership of these organizations is largely financially driven. And what that can do is it create a fairly short time horizon for decisions. And I believe that in the short term, your interests might diverge from your clients, but in the long term, your client's interests and your interests are rarely at odds. And some of the things that are happening with the fee-for-service models that most agencies are beholden to is that it's putting so much downward pressure on the rates that it's forcing the creativity to be with how you globally deliver the work, which creates a lot of complexity in terms of the team dynamics. And to many clients will tell you that it's resulted in them having increasingly less experienced teams. That's one problem statement. And I believe that, just putting a performance incentive on a relationship is not the same as truly being a partner and having skin in the game. And so for us, in our best relationships, we've had the opportunity to really come in and co-invest and co-found, in some cases, ideas with our clients. And that alignment of interest and that shift away from paying by the hour, because, hours they're a measure of cost, but they're not a measure of value. That's allowed us to really rethink where we think the industry needs to evolve towards. And that's sort of what I'll say to that at a really high level.
Yeah. And the industry as a whole, I think, is, especially the healthcare industry, is just ridden with organizations, incumbent organizations and institutions that want to preserve the inefficiencies because they make money off of that. And that's no longer going to work into the future, as you sort of pointed out, that I'd imagine that some of these traditional agency models are going to go by the way as, equivalent to like a Blockbuster or, a Kodak. I mean, how would you, see sort of a resurgence or sort of a reinvention of what that model could potentially look like? You talked about, tying it a little bit more, away from the fee for service and not looking at hourly rates, but more value. Paint us a picture. What does that potential agency look like?
Sure. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I can sort of move away from the headlines and focus on the trend lines. The trend lines on the current model, in our opinion, is unsustainable. We talked about sort of the misaligned incentives, the push for more junior talent, and I want to just hammer a little bit more on the economics. The challenge when you have so many quarterly commitments in such an unpredictable world is that it is bound to create side effects. When organizations are more focused on the optics instead of the outcomes, what that does is it creates problems, and those problems compound. Now, Einstein said you can't solve today's problems with the same thinking that created them. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that if you go back to the genesis of the industry, and if you look at some of the names that are representative of some of the component parts of these agency networks, each one of them bought a component part of the mix that was really critical for the evolution of the craft at that time. But today, most of the innovation that we're seeing is in moving people around on an org chart and really with financial creativity as opposed to craft evolution. And so what we believe needs to happen is a few things. The first one is people practices need to be put back front and center. And the degree to which an organization can do that is, people are a beautiful mess, but when you can inspire a team with a challenge that they believe in, they will surprise and delight you in ways that you couldn't expect. Now, I think it was Edison that also said vision without execution is just hallucination. And I think part of that is really the way that these teams are organized. So we believe the customer success teams, and you can think about them as a business group, but each one of these teams have a leadership team that is organized around a client relationships. And I think that's also critical because when you have competing P&Ls, you make it really, really hard for the people within those organizations to do a great job. So I think that structural needs to be done away with. And sure, there's been navigators and all these new rules and structures that attempt to put the customer at the center. But unless you can actually do that economically, I think it's a fail. The next thing is really around the role that technology can play in enabling your teams. Now, we've talked a fair amount about Genome and how that helps us execute and evolve faster in a way that people love. In addition to that, we have a technology stack that enables us to do the same thing for our clients. Most of our clients on a regular basis have people coming in and saying, you have to throw away everything you've done. All of these technology investments were the wrong investments. Now you have to do it using our unified solution for everything. And the problem with that is that it obviously meets with a lot of resistance, as it should, because most of our clients are actually a lot closer than they think. What we've been thinking a lot about is how do we maximize their technology investments to date? Part of that is connecting the vitals of their programs from a data point of view and connecting the dots. Part of that is automation and some of the repeatable parts of the workflow. Part of that is in how we create that unified view of the customer so that they can maximize their relationships and get better insight. And part of that is taking the repeatable building blocks of these programs and turning that into accelerators that can essentially, without locking clients into templates or things that limit the creativity with which they can execute, allow them to accelerate some of these repeatable workflows so that their teams are spending less time on the plumbing and more time really optimizing around their customers' experience. So that's a few of the things. And then the last thing I would say is really the degree to which the organization is designed to evolve. We talked about the relentless pursuit of awesome and this notion of inoculating yourself against the status quo, but that also needs to be paired with a willingness for those experiments to fail. So you need a culture that doesn't just get galvanized by a mission, but actually makes agile practices safe, has places where investments can be made in experiments and the organization can learn from that. So today, I think every agency claims they have a lab. But if you push on that and you ask, how many engineers does it have? What are the crafts that are represented? Are those people also beholden to other metrics, or are they dedicated to it? Is there a profit agenda on these things? What you'd find is that most of them are not really doing R&D. And that to me is a big miss, because we're living at a time where the pace of change is accelerating and will continue to accelerate. If you don't have mechanisms to stress test ideas and take things that may be disruptive to either our revenue streams or our customers' revenue streams and really think about how to adapt them or integrate them into what we're already doing, then I think you miss a big opportunity for evolution. And evolution isn't just about variation, it's also about selection. So if you've got a lab and you know how to instrument these things and can stress test some ideas, what you're going to find is that most of those ideas don't work. And the worst thing you can do is have those things not work at scale. So that's really a big part of, how we're relentlessly trying to push our organization to think differently.
The amazing insights, and it almost goes back to what you had talked about earlier about the need for digital Darwinism. Tons. I've been in this industry for so long, and lots of talk, lots of headlines, lots of buzzwords, very little action, or at least just action on the surface. And what I love about Klick and what you guys are doing is you put your money where your mouth is and actually live what you guys preach and teach. I, for one, am very excited about that change. So sort of coming to a conclusion here, I mean, what's the next chapter for you personally, and what really keeps you up at night?
So I sleep fairly well.
Well, that's good.
The thing that energizes me is critically thinking, not blindly following. The things that would keep me up at night would be egos and leases. We talked about leases and debt and how my father scared me out of that at a very young age. Egos are also, everybody's got an ego. You want people that are proud to sign their name. What you just want to make sure is that that ego isn't making the wrong decisions or showing up at meetings and the impact that it's having on team camaraderie. So people dynamics always of top concern. Our governor on our growth has always been our ability to attract great leadership that brings in experience and wisdom that we don't have. And often, because of some of those practices that we talked about that prioritize optics over outcomes, there's a deprogramming period and a period of getting them to really understand the way we think. And, one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is just the difference between 90% and 110% being multiples, because the wrong norms have been set in almost every industry, and people don't regularly over deliver. And I don't think it's just a grit thing. I think it's an economics thing. And often it's a lack of understanding of what's possible now that wasn't possible just a little while ago.
Yeah.
If I were to loop back to your question in terms of what are going to be some of the most disruptive things on the horizon or what we're thinking about. It's all of the exponential technologies from platform theory to every exponential technology from robotics and AI and machine learning to blockchain to VR and AR and every one of these technologies that's on an exponential curve, but also how it's changing business models and network effects and crowd and on demand. And I think it's really important for leaders to understand how to harness these forces and how to think about using these forces to create winning patterns within their own organization. And in many ways, you and I have talked about this before, but I believe the transformation is a fail state. It's a reward for getting a lot of things wrong upstream. Mm-hmm. And the healthiest and most vibrant organizations are in this state of constantly wrestling with their competitiveness. And I would also say that if you think about the organizations that inspire you the most, you would probably need to accept that most of them don't spend a lot of time thinking about their competition. What they do is they spend a lot of time thinking about their competitiveness. Mm-hmm. And that competitiveness today is largely derived from their agility and their people practices and whether or not they're able to continue to develop talent and bring in talent to meet the ever-evolving needs and changing landscape that has become the norm.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think you just leave me with enough information to perhaps even have a follow-up conversation with you on another episode. But we're gonna come to a close here, and I think you're familiar with our program where I always close out with a series of rapid-fire fill-in-the-blank questions. So if you're ready, we'll go ahead and start off with the first one.
Sure.
All right. The first one is, the best piece of advice I ever received was...
So this one is a tough one. The one that probably touched me the most is that pessimists look smart, but optimists get rich. That abundant mindset is something that really shaped me and had me thinking about my thinking a lot.
I love that one. Okay, next one. I am most curious about...
I am most curious about curiosity. There's just such an abundance of subjects and topics that interest me. But if I had to zero in on one, it would really be culture. And I spent a lot of time traveling the world, but not as a tourist and not going to the tourist traps, but actually sitting back with a very long lens and quietly watching how people treat each other, not how they treat tourists. Because, to me, that's a way to zoom out and really see how culture and shapes behavior and the pros and cons of different cultural norms. And that's something that I think is probably one of the hardest things for me to wrestle with, and therefore one of the things I enjoy spending time on more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of good sense. Actually explains a lot about you. I like that one. Certainly explains a lot about what you do and what you focus on as a company as well. All right, next one. If you had to write a book about yourself, sort of an autobiography, the title of that book would be?
Conscious Creativity.
Conscious Creativity. Okay, explain.
Well, I think that success leaves a lot of clues behind, and we've been incredibly fortunate over the years to have been able to not just achieve our goals, but do it in a way that was very conscious. And, we sort of talked about the consciousness with which we think about our people, but that permeates the way we think about our clients and the stewardship responsibility that we have for their careers and ultimately the human impact of our work. But I think it's also something that's deeply it's a core part of the essence and character of all the people that we choose to spend time with. And that consciousness is something that I don't think is, it's being talked about a lot more in business today, but I'm not sure that the word is always used appropriately. And the creativity part should be self-evident. You can't achieve anything great by following somebody else's best practices. If you spend your next little while chasing a dream of catching up to where some market leader was a few years ago, you're always going to find yourself a little bit behind. So I think the ability to creatively think and find new solutions to problems and do so with the lens of consciousness and really thinking about the human impact for all the stakeholders involved in everything that you do is something that I would hope everybody should aspire to. And I think that what we're going to find is in a world that's a lot more open and transparent than it's ever been, that's going to be a winning formula because Don Tapscott has a great line. He says, your organization is already naked, so you might as well get buff. And I would say you as a person are already naked because with social media and with the degree to which everybody can find out everything about anybody, your values are going to start to become a core part of your brand and your organization's brand. And that conscious creativity has been a great compass for us.
You're full of all sorts of great quotes today. It reminds me of a Warren Buffett one that said, I think he said, we know when the tide goes out, that's when you truly discover who's got their swimsuit on and who's left in the puff.
I love that.
And I love yours. The success leaves us clues. Wow, I've never heard that one before. Okay, yeah. 2 more. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, or someone that's created as a caricature, who would you invite and what would you talk about?
So I'd want to invite back some of the people that I think shaped history in ways that I respect the most. So Gandhi would definitely be at the top of that list for me. I'd also, is it one dinner or am I having 3 dinners with 3 different
Shape
people?
it however you want. You want multiple dinners?
Well, if we're curating a single, we're curating a single dinner, then I'd probably want to get Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, and somebody with a tremendous amount of influence today at the table, and just see what happens. You do that very well with unusual intersections, but you're somewhat limited by the constraint of these needing to be living people. But it's always motivating for me to just connect the dots and see a few individuals. So whether it's Elon Musk or Bill Gates sitting down with Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln, I think that there's a lot of empathy and a lot of inspiration for all of us to take from not just what they achieved, but how they achieved it in a way that was motivating and loved and has kept them as extraordinary change agents throughout history.
Maybe in the future, there's going to be some way to make the dead come alive again by making these holograms and applying some intelligent learning AI that absorbs all of their back history and information and has a conversation with us. You never know.
Yeah. Martine Rothblatt is working on that with Ray Kurzweil and a few folks you know.
Yeah, the future is already here. Last question. On this podcast, as you know, we celebrate what makes us unique, what makes us different. So how would you fill in the following blank? I'm unusual because...
I'm going to go back to conscious creativity, but if you consider that a cheat, I think more than anything, what's helped us remain consistently lucky is the entrepreneurial spirit. You sort of talked about the defensive nature of many cultures. I think history is on the side of the attackers. I'm not sure that military language is great for people that are in the healing industry, but I do think that if you reduce down what is entrepreneurial spirit at its core, it's a bias for action. It's a willingness to try things. It's a willingness to fail, and it's a willingness to course correct as many times as you need, and keeping the grit. And I'm blessed to be surrounded by people that are a lot smarter and more experienced than me, and that inspire us every single day. And I think one of the things that we're able to develop in people is a willingness to act, and that bias for action, I think, more than anything, has helped us remain consistently lucky.
Yeah, I mean, having known you, I think that's great. I mean, I'll sort of add in how I think you're unusual as well. I mean, I certainly see you, having worked with a number of executives across the organizations, you're certainly unusual because you lead with heart and you lead with empathy over sometimes profits and make sacrifices there. And I think that's very distinct and what a lot of other leaders try to aspire to, but you certainly live it. So, Leah, I'm so grateful to have you on the show. It is always amazing having a conversation with you. I learn something new every time. Before we close out the show, if somebody wanted to learn more about you, more about Klick, get a copy of your book or anything else that you're doing, where would you direct them to go?
Twitter, Leerom Segal, LeeRomSegal, Klick.com, that's Klick with a K, KLICK.com, and you can shoot me an email. It's just Lee, Lee, at klick.com, klick.com. Gotham, this was a pleasure as always. I always learn a lot from your questions as well, and this was no different. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
See you soon. Bye-bye. Hi again. It's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.